Welcome to the presentation of a lecture from Gnostic Radio, a free public service from the Gnostic tradition of Samael Aun Beor. Gnosis is the root wisdom of the world's greatest knowledge. Gnosis is a universal teaching of practical science, whose goal is absolute liberation from suffering and the complete development of the human being. This lecture is one of hundreds available as free downloads, podcasts, or transcriptions. Our lectures range in topic and complexity in order to address the many needs of humanity. We invite you to browse our library of lectures to find teachings that suit you. Twice a month, Gnostic Radio broadcasts live and includes a free online classroom allowing listeners to see images, read related scriptures, and ask questions of the speaker. To learn how to participate, visit gnosticradio.org. Gnostic Radio is a service of Glorianne Publishing, a non-profit organization. The lectures and radio broadcast have been made possible by the financial support of listeners like you. Most spiritual schools recommend a donation of $10 to $20 per lecture. To make a donation, visit gnosticradio.org. Now, with heartfelt wishes for the end of suffering for all creatures, we begin the lecture. May all beings be happy.
Today we're going to talk about the elements of spiritual growth. And to understand what the elements in spiritual growth are, we need to also understand what we mean by spiritual growth. There's a lot of misinformation about spirituality in the world today, in modern culture, that causes us to have misconceptions and misunderstandings about things that unfortunately we take for granted, but that can gravely harm our spiritual growth. So to understand what spiritual growth means, we have to understand what is spirit. This word spirit in English has been terribly abused, especially within the last 100 years. Nowadays, no one can give an accurate definition to the word spirit. We use it from things ranging from the feeling of a certain kind of music or art to descriptions of ghosts and phantoms to discussions of God. So our definition of spirit is very imprecise and not founded in the mysteries. If we look at what Gnosis, or the universal knowledge, teaches us about spirit, we can look at any of the ancient traditions and the etymologies of the words used for spirit, and they all agree. Spirit in Sanskrit is Atman. Directly translated, that means self, but it refers to our inner spirit, the essence of ourselves, the ultimate sense of where we come from. And that spirit in Hebrew is called ruach, spirit or breath, the self. And that's also known in the Kabbalah as chesed, which means mercy. So when we talk about spiritual growth, in genuine mysticism, that growth is a reference to our innermost. It is the growth of the being. It is the emergence of the Buddha within us. That is not the terrestrial self, what St. Paul in his writings called the natural man or the animal man, the terrestrial person. When we talk about spiritual growth, we're not talking about the spiritual person. We're talking about the growth of our innermost, Atman, Chesed, our inner Buddha. Real spiritual growth is the empowerment, growth, and expansion of our innermost. And through that growth, we as a terrestrial person also benefit. It's a reciprocal relationship. That's why Paul, in his writings, talked about the relationship between the heavenly man and the earthly man. Two parts of one being. Physically, terrestrially, we here are what Paul called a natural human being. Natural meaning in the natural world, in the physical world. With an earthly body, a physical body. What the alchemists called the philosophical earth. This body is built up out of the earth, as it says in the Bible. From the dust of the earth. That earth houses spiritual attributes or archetypes. That spirit or vivifying energy is what gives us life. It is the ruach or spirit or breath that causes this body to have existence, life. Our consciousness is an agent of the innermost. It is an agent of the Spirit. It's related to the Spirit, but it is not the same thing as the Spirit. So this title, The Elements in Spiritual Growth, really requires that you understand that Spirit is the being, our inner Father, our inner Mother, our inner Buddha, whatever names you want to use. It is that root of our inner experience as a self, as a soul. Where our soul comes from is our spirit. We need to understand that because until we clearly grasp that the terrestrial person is not everything, and that we are just an extension of something more, something that we ignore, we cannot really understand genuine spirituality. And this is the problem in this day and age. People think spirituality is about me. And spirituality and religion have become all about me and myself. And people who want spiritual growth really just want to adorn themselves, to dress themselves in robes and in different garments, psychologically, to give off a certain appearance, or to feel certain things. They want to feel comforted or feel secure because they are, as they say, quote, spiritual. The real spiritual person is in connection, in dialogue with their inner being. This is not something vague or invented or fantasized. It is experienced. True spirituality is the direct connection between the terrestrial person and the spiritual man, Atman, our inner Buddha. Real spirituality begins when that connection is established. So spiritual growth can be defined in that way. First, accessing and acquiring that connection so that we no longer believe in God or theorize about our inner self or inner spirit. We know it. We can experience it. We can taste it. We can touch it. We can talk to it. We can get information from it. We know what it is through our experience. That is the beginning of real spiritual growth. So we need to know the elements that cause that to occur. The reason we don't have spiritual growth now, and the reason we don't know our innermost now, because we don't know the elements, and we don't know the spirit. We're in a deep state of ignorance. So we have a lot to learn. In the ancient scriptures of Hinduism, we find a quote that explains the elements for spiritual growth. And this is in the Taittiriya Upanishad, which is a very ancient writing. This Upanishad states, "From Atman did space come into being. From space, air. From air, fire. From fire, the waters. From the waters, the earth. From the earth, plants. From plants, food. And from food, man. This ancient scripture is outlining the unfolding of elements in the spiritual sense. Unfortunately, people read this in the literal, physical sense and think that's its only meaning. It does have some application to physical matter and how matter is created literally and physically. But that's not why the Upanishad was written. The Upanishads and the Vedas and the other scriptures of all ancient religions were written for the growth of spirit, not the growth of matter physically. The physical part, from the spiritual point of view, is the lowest, most unimportant aspect. We need it. That's why we have physical bodies. But physical matter dies. Physical matter is impermanent and unreliable. So Scripture is not written for physical purposes. It's written for spiritual purposes. This Scripture explains that from Atman did space come into being. I explained to you that Atman is a Sanskrit word that literally translated means self. But it doesn't mean our terrestrial self. It means our spiritual self. What some people call our real self. We can say it is our real being. We can say it is our innermost, or in Christian terms, our inner Father. In Buddhist terms, it is our Idam, or our inner Buddha. From Atman did space come into being. Space here is not physical space. It isn't the space outside of this planet. It is a psychological and spiritual space. This phrase, from Atman did space come into being, encompasses the first few lines of the book of Genesis, where in the beginning the earth was formless and void. That formless and void is the absolute, what in Hebrew is called the Ein Sof, and the Ein Sof Or. In Sanskrit terms, this is Shunyata. In Buddhist terms, it is called Samantabhadra, or the Adi Buddha. It's the level of existence or level of beingness that is empty, that is ultimate, that is the repository of all potential. It is not nothing, but it is also not something. That is this space. And as it comes into being, it becomes what we call Akash in Sanskrit terms. Akash is the root vibration of the pure potentiality that's entering into manifestation. It is the root energy or root substance of everything. We can call it Mula Prakriti, the seed root of all things, the root energy. So from this space came air, from the air came fire, from the fire came the waters, from the waters the earth. So here we find the classic four elements: air, fire, water, and earth. Anyone who studied philosophy knows about these four elements. We find them in every major tradition in the world. They were known in Babylonia, Chaldea, amongst the Greeks and Romans, amongst the ancient Chinese, the Taoists, amongst the Hindus and the Buddhists. In every tradition in the world, these four elements have been described in varying ways. Once again, humanity has made the foolish mistake of believing that these four elements are literal. So our modern so-called scientists and philosophers read these ancient texts and laugh at the ancient ones and say, it's ridiculous that all the ancients thought that everything came from these four elements and that was it. That literally everything was made from physical air, physical fire, physical water, physical earth. The fools are not the ancient philosophers. The fools are the modern ones who don't know how to read, who don't know how to understand what was written. These four elements in every tradition do not refer to physical elements. If you study the writings of Paracelsus, Aristotle, Plato, Lao Tse, Krishna, Buddha, all of them talk about these four elements in every religion. But they're not talking about physical elements. They're talking about subtle energies, psychological, spiritual forces in nature, in everything, in every level, from the absolute down. The space, the absolute, comes into being. That is the manifestation. In the four worlds of Kabbalah, this is the movement from Atziluth into Bria, where the archetypes move into creation. That process of creation is where the space becomes air, fire, water, earth. Everything that exists emerges out of the space. So all the way to the top of the tree of life, we see Keter, the crown, the father, the Adi Buddha. That Adi Buddha, Keter, the ancient of days, comes into being through air, fire, water, earth, but in the level of Keter. In a very high dimension that's extremely subtle, and physically we can't see it. But from that root archetype, everything emerges and elaborates into different combinations of these four vibrations. Because really that's what they are. This term air uses what we experience physically as air as an archetype, as an allegory, as a metaphor, as a way of understanding something that is not physical. What is the quality of air? Movement. Something subtle. Something not fixed and solid. So air in this scripture and in all the ancient scriptures refers to a vibration of energy, a vibration of prakriti that's very subtle. It moves rapidly. Fire has the quality of temperature, heat and cold. So that air also has a temperature, heat and cold. It also has fluidity related to the waters. It also has the potential for solidity related to the earth. So we see these four elements really relate to qualities of matter and energy. Not literal air, not literal fire, not literal water. Qualities. In this way we can understand that these four elements are just a deeper condensation of the three qualities of prakriti, which we talked about in a previous lecture. That primordial space, when it emerges into manifestation, does so with three descriptive attributes, which are in Sanskrit called gunas. So the triguna are three different attributes, or qualities of matter and energy. And as those descend and become more complicated, they become four. And those four descend and create all the worlds that exist. So where this affects us is how we have come into being. Our inner consciousness, our true nature, enters into manifestation in the way that's described here. At the ultimate root of our self is space. Inside that space is Atman, the true self. That is the Ein Sof. And what emerges out of that Ein Sof is a ray of light, the Ein Sof or the ray of Okidanok, the ray of creation. It passes through that space. That space in Hinduism is called, at the highest level, Prakriti. It becomes Akash. That Akash is space, which becomes air, fire, water, earth. These are the differentiating qualities of the consciousness as it enters the manifestation. And long time ago, when that spark of light descended out of the absolute, our spark, and first came into matter for the first time, we didn't come into matter as a human being. We came into matter as a simple spark of light that needed to learn and grow and develop. So it starts at the lowest level as a simple element. Moving through these elements, we started as an elemental, a simple spark of consciousness in nature, and slowly developed over many eons through the kingdoms of the elementals, which relate to these four elements. And gradually, we graduated into becoming more sophisticated, and we became plants. And after a long period of time, that consciousness growing in the existence of level of plants, we graduated up and became animals. What here is called food. And gradually, after many more eons of development, we became more and more knowledgeable and experienced about the inner relationship between consciousness, matter, and energy, that we then entered into the humanoid kingdom. And now we find ourselves in a mess. Because having been in the humanoid kingdom for a while, we've made a lot of mistakes. And we've forgotten where we've come from. We've forgotten who we are. So we need to learn. So here are the 5 elements that were outlined in that scripture. Space is the first element to emerge out of the being. In Sanskrit, it's called Akash. You'll also find it in other scriptures called Vyom and Shunya. Shunya is also related to that term Shunyata, which I mentioned. And from space comes the air, which is traditionally, in most cases, called Vayu, but can also be called Marut. And we spoke about the Maruts, which are types of beings related to the air, in our lecture about Hanuman. Air can also be called Pavan. From the air comes the fire, Tehas, or Agni. And from the fire comes water, Apas, Ap, or Jala in Sanskrit. And finally, the earth, which is traditionally, in most cases, called Prithvi, but can also be called Kishti and Bhumi, depending on the scripture that you're reading. So these are the 5 elements that we find in every religion. In many cases, 4 are specified, because the 5th is the secret. The 5th element is the one we most need. So in most written scriptures and documents about the secret tradition, the 5th is left undefined. The 5th is left unspoken. If we study the scriptures of alchemy, for example, in the West, we can find a lot written about these 4 elements, which some alchemists condensed as 3, such as Paracelsus. But the 5th is always there, but hidden. We may talk about that in future lectures. So as I was explaining, these 5 elements are not physical. We're not concerned with the physical aspects. They relate to physical matter. I mean, obviously, our physical fire is a reflection of spiritual fire. But we're not concerned with the physical aspect. We need to be concerned with the spiritual. So we need to understand what these 5 symbolize. Space represents the attributes of the absolute. So psychologically and spiritually, it means expansiveness. If you've ever studied the Tao, Chinese Taoism, it's all about the 5th element, space. The way of the Tao is the way of being expansive, all-embracing, all-awareness, all-encompassing, unreactive, capable of receiving anything and not being disturbed because there's so much room in oneself. Air really symbolizes the psychological and spiritual quality of mobility, flexibility, movement. And fire reflects the spiritual and psychological characteristic of temperature. Our psychological temperature, our spiritual temperature. This relates with our temperament, the nature of our consciousness, not our personality, not our mind, but consciousness. This is where these 5 are most important, in qualities of consciousness. They reflect into the qualities of our ego, because the ego was created through misuse of consciousness. But what we really need to grasp is how to access these 5 qualities with the free awakened consciousness. The 4th is water, which relates with fluidity, the ability to be spiritually and psychologically fluid or flexible. And finally, earth, which is solidity, firmness, to have a strong foundation of powerful strength, willpower. So these 5 elements in any scripture symbolize these psychological and spiritual qualities that we need to develop and understand. Now, when we study these 5 elements in Hinduism and Buddhism and in Gnosis, we find that there are many attributes related to them. So this graphic shows you those many attributes, and they all are important, and they all have practical value. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. If you want to study this in detail, it's in the book Tarot and Kabbalah by Samael and Vior. These attributes and relationships are really important. And they become more important the further along you go in your spiritual process. Briefly, what I want to point out on this chart is that every element also has a mantric value or a sound that stimulates that quality. So working with mantra or vibrations, conscious energies, these qualities can be developed, can be invoked and nourished. And the one of specific importance is related with the 5th element, the Akash or ether. That mantra is Ha. If you listen to this course that was given recently about the runes, you'll remember the mantra Hagal. And Hagal is a very ancient rune in the heart of every language. And the Hagal is an X with a line through it. In other words, it's somewhat like a 6-pointed star. Interestingly, that Hagal, which begins with H-A, is symbolized by this sign. And that sign happens to also be a sign used to represent ether. If you put a circle around that H, or that Hagal, you find the sign for the ether, the Akash. And the rune Hagal is that root creative force in the runes. From the Hagal, all the runes come. All the runes are hidden in the Hagal, in that shape. So here we find the Ha as the 5th element from which the other elements come. Remember that scripture stated, from the space comes the air. So from the ether, the Akash, comes the air, and then the fire, then the water, then the earth. So all of the other elements come out of this Akash or ether. That makes this vibration the most important. These 5 in Hinduism are called tattvas. This word tattva means vibration, movement. All 5 of these are vibrations of the same thing, but they are differentiated by the quality of their movement. The earth, the water, the fire, the air all come out of the Akash, the ether. They are just modifications of that. We call them tattvas. They are just modifications or vibrations of ether. The air is the fluidity the movement, not fluidity, the mobility of ether. Whereas the earth, or the tattva prithvi, is the solidity of the ether, the akash. This might seem theoretical or unimportant to you, but if you want to have any real impact in changing your life or helping to influence the lives of others, this will become the most important thing you know. Why is that? Everyone who wants to be spiritual wants to be a priest or a priestess. That's the goal, right? To be someone who has power. Where does the priest or priestess get their power? We call these people priests, but really the ancient word for priest is mag. M-A-G. And if you've ever heard of the three magi, or the three kings, malachim in Hebrew, those were three priests. Magician means priest. It comes from magi. A priest or a magician is someone who knows how to work with forces of nature, both outside and inside. What was Moses? He was a great priest, a great magician. Commanded the water, commanded the air, commanded the fire, and the earth. Outside of himself, literally, physically. What about Nicholas Flamel, Basil Valentine, Paracelsus, Galen, Hermes Trismegistus, Jesus of Nazareth, Krishna, Milarepa, Quetzalcoatl. All magicians, priests. The power that they had, and still have, was derived from the tattvas, from these elements, not from anywhere else. The power to command nature is the ability to conquer and command and control these elements. Akash, air, water, fire, and earth. That begins not outside of oneself, inside. We have to first command these elements inside of ourselves to control our own kingdom, our own earth. And when we can command those forces in ourselves, then by the natural law of nature, we will also command them outside. The ancient axiom says, as above, so below. If you can control it here in your own earth, physically, psychologically, spiritually, you can do it outside also. This is accomplished by understanding that these elements are not dead matter, the way we think of matter. This is part of the mistake that we've made. When we read these scriptures and we read about the air and the fire and the water, we think of dead matter. A cup of water and we think it's dead. And we think it's just a bunch of atoms and molecules and minerals sitting there, and that's it. We're wrong. Every atom in nature is a trinity. It has matter. It has energy. Those we can verify. But every atom also has consciousness. Every atom. And nowadays, fortunately, it may be too late, but finally the scientists are beginning to recognize that this is a fact. That all atoms actually have consciousness. Because as they're performing experiences or experiments related with quantum physics, they're discovering that the consciousness of the scientist affects the experiment. When the consciousness of the scientist is observing the behavior of a quanta of light, the light changes its behavior. If it is not observed, it behaves differently. All atoms are like this because they have that spark, that essence that we have. They're just much simpler than we are because they're at the beginning of their manifestation, whereas we are quite advanced in evolutionary terms. The human organism is far more advanced than a simple atom of hydrogen. Both have consciousness, but in their own levels. We can't compare the consciousness of a humanoid to the consciousness of a hydrogen atom in the same way that we can't compare the physical body of a humanoid with the physical body of a sun. The scale is simply too huge. Nonetheless, we need to understand the similitude and that all atoms have consciousness. And all atoms have consciousness in relation with these elements. Not only the atoms, but all of the matter, all of the organisms, all living things. The magician, the priest, is the one who knows that and knows how to command it. When Milarepa was able to fly, how did he do it? He commanded the elements of the air. Not only outside of himself, but inside of himself. When Moses parted the waters, how did he do that? He commanded the elementals of the waters. But it wasn't the terrestrial body of Moses that did it. It was the innermost of Moses, the spirit, the inner being that works through his human part to perform the deeds he must perform in order to grow. You see, our consciousness enters into matter and energy to become that Trinity. In order for that Trinity to grow, to become a God, filled with knowledge of how all things work. And that knowledge should give rise to a great love for all beings. To be a magician, we need to learn how these 5 elements work in ourselves, physically, psychologically, spiritually, and be able to control them and command them. This is not an easy task. This is a task that requires an enormous amount of self-knowledge and a lot of study and training. So we're introducing these 5 elements to you so you'll understand how to start seeing them in yourselves and in nature. These 5 elements or energies are living forces, not dead. They aren't like matter that is inert. They have consciousness inside us and outside of us. Everything about us physically, just on the physical level, is a process of the interaction of these 5 elements. When we eat, when we drink, when we walk, when we talk, we're using energy. And all that energy has been made available to us through a process of transformation, through our eating and drinking and breathing, and through the energy of the consciousness that's active in our bodies. And all of that motion of energy, we don't do it consciously. We're not digesting our food consciously or transforming the oxygen into the bloodstream consciously. We're not managing the forces and fluids in our glandular system, in our endocrine system consciously. It's happening for us on its own. How? Well, we have a lot of scientific explanations of how things happen in the matter, but as I explained, all matter is a trinity. Matter, energy, and consciousness. So what about the consciousness of your stomach? The consciousness in your bloodstream, in your heart, in your lungs, in your liver. There is consciousness there, but not your consciousness, because we're all asleep, unaware of what the liver is doing right now. But somebody's aware. Who? The elementals in the body. An uncountable number of monads that serve us physically. Atoms that are not as developed as we are, but who are growing and learning. And their process of growing and learning is to perform the roles that they're performing in our bodies right now. These are atomic intelligences. If you want to know more about this, read the book Dayspring of Youth. The whole book is about this. It's a hugely complex and beautiful system that we all ignore. Those atoms are related to these elements. They are intelligences in nature. Moreover, everything we eat and drink is related with elementals. When you eat a plant, you're eating the physical body of an elemental, killing it so you can live. And that's the plant's role in nature, to die for you so that you can live, so that you can grow. So are you using that well? Do you respect the plant? Are you grateful to the plant? Are you grateful to the animal? Do you express that gratitude? Do you express the understanding and knowledge that every single thing you eat and drink and breathe has consciousness and that you are killing it and that you have to, and that's nature? All of those elements we incorporate, we transform with the help of other elementals that are in the body. That's just to sustain our physical life. If we want spiritual life, we have to take that to a whole new level. The incorporation and transformation of energy is the basis of spiritual life. It's the basis of physical life. We know that. We can see that. We have to take in and transform energy every day, all day, to stay alive. If you stop breathing, you will die. Wake up. If you stop eating, you will die. If you stop drinking water, you will die. Your spiritual life also has its nourishment. If you have no spiritual life now, if you are spiritually dead, it's because you have not been nourished. So you need to know the nourishment that will nourish your spiritual life. What is that nourishment? It's here on this graphic. Down at the bottom, we find the list of the elements. Second from the bottom. Related to the Akash or ether, we find the word or letters A, Z, F. This is an alchemical equation. 3 elements in harmony that relate to the Trinity. These are 3 elements that relate to forces in nature that are transformed in one way. Sex, Tantra, alchemy. These are the basic 3 forces in nature, the 3 gunas, the 3 elements that here we're calling 4, but that are transformed specifically through the transmutation of sexual forces. Related to the air, we see here written grape juice. And this is because in the physical juices of the grape are hidden spiritual atoms. Not only in grape juice, it's just the primary example that we utilize. There are other elements in nature that have that. Also in the fire, related to fire, we see here red meat. And that's because in the physical matter of the red meat are spiritual atoms that if you take them in consciously will nourish your spiritual growth and life. Furthermore, with apas or water, we see the fish. And with prithvi or earth, we see grains. So we see here 5 types of food. It's not to say that these should be the only foods you eat, or that you have to eat them all. What this is saying is that related to these 5 elements, the most potent spiritual atoms related to those 5 elements are in these 5 foods. And yes, we're calling sex here a type of food, because if you use sexuality in the right way, it does not deplete you of your forces. it gives you forces. Most people use sex to deplete themselves, to exhaust themselves. But that is not the right way. Upright sexuality, or chaste sexuality, utilizes sex in order to nourish the body, the heart, the mind, the spirit, the soul. And so, through transmutation, spiritual atoms are absorbed physically, psychologically, and spiritually. And the same is true for these other 4 elements. The clue to do this is every time you eat or drink or engage with any type of sexual activity, you should do it consciously, with full awareness of what you're doing, with full attentiveness, being there, present, and paying attention to what you're doing. To be conscious is how you feed the consciousness. If you're distracted, you're not feeding your consciousness. So you can just simply eat an apple. And if you eat it consciously, the atoms from that apple are transformed and nourish the consciousness as well as the body. And to facilitate that more and make it more powerful, you can use a mantra, which is from Sanskrit, which we spell K-R-I-M, but is pronounced Kreem. So that I is an E sound. Kreem. You pronounce that mentally while you eat. That mantra is related to the Divine Mother Kali, who is the destroyer. So when you use the mantra Kreem, you're invoking the power of the Divine Mother to pulverize those elements and separate the bad from the good and to absorb the goodness into yourself consciously. And this is how you nourish yourself consciously. And this is on all levels, physically, spiritually. So we recommend that students try to have these elements in their diets. Not necessarily every day, but to at least try. Especially when you're dealing with the particular tattvas that these foods are related to. They can have an impact. For example, someone who has a lot of fire in their temperament, psychological temperament, who's a fiery person, if they eat a lot of red meat, they'll become even more fiery. So to reduce that temperament, they should eat less meat. And an airy type of person, who's very mobile, very swept about, can counter that by eating more grains. It will give them more solidity and firmness. It will help them settle. So in this way, you can see there are subtle influences you can work with in relation with these foods. More importantly, to become a magician, you need these forces in your body. You need the atoms. Because in order for you to begin to command the forces of nature outside of you, you have to command them inside of you. We're going to talk about that in detail in a moment. But the way it's accomplished is important for you to understand. These 4 elements, in conjunction with Akash, all have specific relationships, psychologically, spiritually, with everything in life. Any goal that you want to achieve will have a relationship with the tattvas. So if you have a goal to help someone, you can work with the tattvic or elemental forces in order to help that person. And there are specific priestly activities, rituals of priesthood that harness these forces. I'll give you an example. Most people know about the Catholic Mass. And you find that same Mass in other religions, but in different names. The exact same function, with different words, different structures, exists in Buddhism, exists in Hinduism. In Buddhism, instead of taking what the Catholics and Christians call the Eucharist, or the host, the Buddhists take, the word's escaping me now. I'll remember later. There's a specific word for the same thing, and the same amongst the Hindus. So in those rituals, they have symbolic elements related to these tattvas. The grain in the West, in the Eucharist, is wheat, usually served as a wafer or as a piece of bread. That is a symbolic food. But when it's properly consecrated and blessed, has spiritual atoms of high value. The water, of course, is usually given with water. The fire is usually a small bit of meat. Again, it can be symbolic. It's not always literal meat, although in some traditions it is. And the air is grape juice or wine. In other traditions, the earth, the grain, can be represented by corn or by rice. So if you have participated in any other world tradition, you'll find the same ritual elements where the congregation will receive from the priest blessed food. That food is really symbolic. And if it's properly blessed, it will convey spiritual atoms that have been blessed and consecrated through the consciousness of the priest. And this is the important point. The priest or the magician is the one who consecrates that event, and through the purity of his or her psyche brings those divine forces into the foods. And how can that priest do that unless they themselves are pure? They are the vehicle of that force. In the Bible, we see this established in the very ancient times by Melchizedek, who blessed wine and bread and gave it to Moses. He was a priest to Moses. And Moses was a great magician. And Jesus was a priest after the order of Melchizedek, performing the same function. That's how we got the Eucharist of today. Through Moses, through Melchizedek. And Melchizedek got it from others. It's very ancient. So that's a symbolic ritual in which spiritual atoms are brought in through these elements for the blessings of the congregation in order to give spiritual nourishment. That's the value of those sacraments. We gave a whole course about the sacraments of the Gnostic Church. So if you want to know more about that, you can read that. These are rituals you can perform yourself, even if you're on your own. And it's all explained in the course. So that priest performing the ritual has to command these elementals. The atoms that are placed in that bread are brought there by pygmies and gnomes. We say pygmies and gnomes, we don't mean literal physical pygmies or gnomes in the physical world. We're talking about the consciousness of the elementals related to that tattva, prithvi. All the elements have their conscious elements, their conscious value. So we need to know what they are and how to command them. And as I was explaining, everything about us is derived from those elements. Everything. To understand this, I want to read to you a quote from Paracelsus. Paracelsus is one of the greatest doctors this planet has ever seen, and is also a great alchemist, and is one of the teachers of Samael Aun Weor. So Paracelsus wrote, "The Magi, in their wisdom, asserted that all creatures might be brought to one unified substance, which substance they affirm may, by purifications and purgations, attain to so high a degree of subtlety, such divine nature and occult property, as to work wonderful results. For they considered that by returning to the earth, and by a supreme magical separation, a certain perfect substance would come forth, which is at length, by many industrious and prolonged preparations, exalted and raised up above the range of vegetable substances into mineral, above mineral into metallic, and above perfect metallic substances into a perpetual and divine quintessence, including in itself the essence of all celestial and terrestrial creatures. Paracelsus wrote that in his book, The Aurora of the Philosophers. And what that statement is saying in synthesis, I was incorrect, but Melchizedek gave the ritual to Abraham, not Moses. So I've been corrected. So I apologize. What that statement is saying is that when I explained to you the descent of forces into nature, in all those forces remains the seed of its source, of their sources. So in all of our atoms is a connection back to their roots in the Ein Sof. In other words, in every atom of earth, there's a connection back to Akash, which in turn connects back to the root of all things, which in that scripture was called Atman, or the self. Paracelsus is stating that it should be possible through purification to return the creature back to that ultimate root and thereby acquire all the power of the magician. And that root power, or that perfection of that energy, is called quintessence. In English, we use this word quintessence a lot now, but actually its roots come from alchemy. Here we see an image of the tree of life on a physical body. This is us. We are a tree of life, physically, spiritually. Once again, it's not the physical component we're that concerned with. We're really concerned more with the psychological, spiritual aspect of how this tree of life functions in ourselves. Every single portion of the tree of life is a combination of tattvic elements in varying degrees of subtlety, and with all of the huge variety we see everywhere in existence. Everything about us is rooted in the elements, both in the positive, free, unconditioned consciousness, which is symbolized as the upper portion of the tree of life, and also in the conditioned consciousness, symbolized in the lower portion, which we generally call hell, but which, taking aside the physical aspect, symbolizes our psyche, our consciousness, that is trapped in conditioned state. Hell is our subconsciousness, our unconsciousness, our infraconsciousness. We have our own hell. That hell is that blackness that we see when we look inside of our hearts and minds. It is what we see in our nightmares. It is all of those elements of our psyche that surge and, filled with desires, manipulate us and motivate us to perform all the mistaken actions that we perform, physically, emotionally, and mentally. Hell is a condensation of elements, the 5 elements, but through mistaken action. So we can see there that hell is a karmic condensation or crystallization of those elements. That is our ego. That is our karma. So here we're caught between two worlds. That which is possible, which is to take that quintessence and perfect ourselves. On the other side, we see that which traps us. So to become one with that quintessence and to become the perfect magician, priest or priestess, requires that this hell aspect be purged, purified, destroyed, so that all the energy that's trapped there is liberated. And that energy is what creates the quintessence. It's what establishes those forces that rise us up or raise us up to heaven. This is the essential foundation of spiritual growth. In order for our innermost to grow, we have to free ourselves from our conditioned state, our state of ignorance. In other words, our pride traps the spiritual atoms of our being. Our being cannot grow because of our pride. For our being to grow, our pride must be destroyed, so that those energies, those tattvic forces, can be freed, and so that that consciousness can grow. If we don't free that pride, destroy that pride, and free that consciousness from that crystallization, nature will do it for us. But nature's way is very painful and very long. And that's what all religions have traditionally represented as hell. It's a great long process of purification in which we are purified of pride, anger, lust, laziness, gluttony, greed, envy, and all of the other discursive factors that cause us to behave in the wrong way. Nature will purify us, and we will not enjoy it. This is the law. This is the way nature functions. So our choice is to let nature do it and suffer, or do it ourselves. To do it ourselves requires that we learn the science. We analyze ourselves, and we appeal to God for help. And believe me, God will help. But God won't make you feel good about it. Purification is not easy. To be purged of lust requires that you see the lust, and that you confront it, and that you deal with it. If you avoid it, you cannot deal with it. We have to become conscious of everything about ourselves and remove that which is impure. And this is the only way to grow spiritually. If you ignore your anger or your pride or your envy, then you are in ignorance. And thus you are spiritually stagnant or dead, not growing, maybe even getting worse. And chances are, we are. Spiritual growth, or the growth of our innermost, comes through cognizance, knowledge, and that is knowledge of ourselves. So, to understand what that means, we'll back up one step, and we'll talk about how those forces work in us. I explained that the Prakriti is that first root level of existence, raw matter, that becomes differentiated into different forms. And at the top level, it has a trinity, 3 aspects, which we talk about as gunas, or root forces in nature. In Kabbalah, those 3 root forces are called the 3 mother letters. The first is Aleph. Aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and its shape is a trinity. It has all 3 in itself. It relates to air, not physical air, but the mobile quality of that root energy. It is highly mobile and flexible and incorporeal. It has the value of the number 1. The second mother letter is Mem, which relates with water. It's the 13th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It also has a trinity in its shape. A dot, a curve, and a line. You see these 3 elements are starting to differentiate. Mem relates with water. To say water in Hebrew, you say ma'im, which is 2 mems, and a yod in the middle. The third mother letter is Shin, which is also a trinity. Shin is related with fire and is the 21st letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It's stated in the Kabbalistic book Sefer Yetzirah, which is the book of formation, that these 3 mother letters were the first emergence, and from them came all the other letters. Again, those letters are not literal. The letters represent spiritual archetypes, forces in us spiritually. These letters are runic symbols of archetypal spiritual aspects of the being. These 3 letters represent the 3 forces, the Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. Air, water, and fire. These 3 forces are behind all creation. Anytime there is a creation, there are 3 forces at work. So when we look at the tree of life, we see these three at the very top. Aleph with Keter, Shin with Hokmah, Mem with Binah. These three forces, or the trinity above, express to create through Da'at, which is the hidden Sephirah just below the upper trinity, and that shape of Da'at is the rune Hagal, which I drew on the board. Hagal in Judaism and Hinduism is represented as a six-pointed star, two interlocked triangles. In other words, this upper triangle divides itself into a duality and unites with itself and forms that Da'at, or Hagal. And from that Hagal comes everything else. All the letters, all the tattvas, all the forces in nature. And in us, they create our inner trinity, our three brains. These three letters rule the three triangles of the tree of life, spiritually and in us, psychologically. Aleph is related with the upper trinity, with our head, with our intellect. Aleph is the air. The mind, the intellect, is related with air. Shin rules the second triangle of the tree of life, the triangle of ethics. And Shin is related with our heart. Shin is fire. This is why we feel fire in our hearts. Temperature is related with the heart. Coldness and warmth. Some of us have a warm temperament. Some of us have a cold temperament. It's related with the movement of Shin in our hearts. And finally, Mem, the water, rules the lower triangle, the triangle of the priesthood, which relates with our third brain, motor, instinctive, sexual. Mem, of course, is related with water, and water is sexual. All creation comes out of the water. We create through sexual waters. Every universe, every sun is born from sexual waters. So that Mem, or Ma'im, is here in sex. So here we see these three mother letters, spiritual archetypes, manifested and crystallized, working through us energetically in our three brains. The question then becomes, how do we use them? How do we use the powers of the air? Have you ever observed how your mind is very mobile? Always darting around? And the thoughts just come and come and come like a great wind that you can't stop. Because the intellect, the mind, is related with air. The heart is related with Shin, with fire. And here's where we feel the temperature that's always changing in us as we react through our circumstances. We feel the heat of anger in our heart. We feel the warmth of love in our heart. We feel the coldness of resentment. Right? All emotions have a temperature. And finally, in Ma'im, in our bodies, we feel the waters of sex boiling. Sometimes they're calm. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're icy and frozen. At other times, they are a raging storm. So we see these basic elements that function in our psychology. We can learn about them through self-observation. What we need to understand, though, is that for spiritual growth to occur, these elements are used to test us, to purify us. You see those three mother letters, Aleph, Shin, and Mem? You see air, fire, and water. What's the fourth element? Where's the earth? It is your body. Your body itself. So here you are, spiritually, psychologically, the four elements. Your body, your mind, your heart, your waters. If you want spiritual growth, all four have to be purified. How does it happen? Are you going to do it on your own? Can you do it on your own? If you observe your mind and you see the density and strength of your psychological tendencies, and you compare that with the strength of your free consciousness, you will quickly come to the realization that it is impossible to do it on your own. It is impossible. It cannot be done. It has never been done. You can only do it with the help of God, the help of the divine. And the one who showed us how to do it is David. In the myth of David, we see David as a young shepherd, powerless, no training, no weapons, just a boy. But by circumstance, he has to face and defeat the greatest warrior of the Philistine army, who is Goliath. The only thing that David has to help him is his faith. So what he does is he believes in God, he has faith in God, and he approaches his enemy, and he picks up a stone and kills Goliath with it, and then chops off his head. That stone is what in alchemy is called a sophic hydrolith. Sophic comes from Sophia, or wisdom. Hydro is water, and lith is stone. So the wise water stone. I told you the water is in your earth in sexuality. So the Sophic hydrolith is that sexual energy being utilized by Sophia, Christ. Wisdom is Chokmah. Wisdom is Christ, that Trinity above, that will aid us by stimulating these elements in us so that we can see them for what they are. And that's why those who begin to transmute their sexual forces to work with the stone, which is centered in Yesod, the sexual energies, begin to receive ordeals, difficulties, psychological tests. Someone who is genuinely transmitting or transmuting their sexual energy will also begin to face a lot of difficulties, psychological difficulties, because this is how the work progresses. People enter into these types of studies and believe, because of their training in pseudo-occultism, that everything in the spiritual path is an ever-increasing ecstasy. And that as soon as you become spiritual, life just gets rosier and rosier. Spiritually, it does. But psychologically, it does not. The genuine aspirant towards full awakening has to face the entirety of their ego. All of it, step by step. And facing that is not something we do willingly. We don't want to face ourselves. We don't want to see how foolish we are, because we want to feel proud. We don't want to see that we are animals psychologically, that we are beasts, filthy. We are not divine. We want our religion to tell us how divine we are. We want our spirituality to make us feel good. It's all lies. The truth is, we're dirty and we need cleaning. The cleaning comes from our own inner being. When we begin to transmute our sexual energy, we begin to nourish our spiritual growth. And the most important place that energy can be used is to clean us, not to give us experiences in the astral plane or with God. We might get that from time to time, but that's not what's most important. What's most important is that we become pure. So our innermost, our divinity, is the one who takes that energy and uses it to bring the ego up, to show the ego to us, so we will face it and change. And that comes through what we call the 4 ordeals. These 4 ordeals are related with those 4 elements. Do you get what I'm explaining here? When you transmute the sexual energy, you are transmuting Akash, the 5th element. And from that 5th element come the other 4. When you transmute sexual energy, you give rise to the ordeals that you must face. expect it. Don't avoid it. You need the ordeals. It's only through psychological tests that you will see what you are and be able to change. So you need to learn how to use the four elements to your advantage in order to conquer the ordeals. This is the point of the lecture. To know how to face ordeals and overcome them. The four ordeals are related with the four elements. This image is an image drawn by an alchemist named Michael Meyer. This image is 400 years old. And it shows the alchemist facing himself. 1 against 4. Those 4 are the 4 elements. Who is the 1? Akash. Ether. Willpower. Transmuted sexual energy. That's why he's raising the club over his head. That club is his will. It is the club of Heracles from the Greek mysteries. Heracles represents willpower. The Christic force, Christic energy of willpower. That is how you overcome the 4 ordeals. You see each of these 4, one has fire, one has air, one has water, and one has a stone. And they're all coming to get him, but they all are him. If you look closely at that image, it's 5 of the same person. Those drawings are of one man. You see? It's all the same person. He's facing himself. This is the secret of alchemy. So our being will give us these ordeals. So we're going to describe them briefly so you understand what to expect. In ordeals of air, you will face the loss of what you love and the loss of whatever gives you material or personal or psychological security. What are these ordeals? They are psychological tests, situations, circumstances that cause your ego to be visible. Let me talk about what these ordeals are in general, and then we'll talk about the specifics. Samael Aun Weor wrote specifically about these ordeals in 2 books, The Revolution of Beelzebub and The Perfect Matrimony. Any sincere student of Gnosis needs these 2 books and study them deeply. They are very important. They're 2 books that he wrote first, and they set the foundation for everything else he wrote. So he wrote in The Revolution of Beelzebub, in the White Lodge, the 4 ordeals are given in order to examine the white disciple's morals. For instance, in the ordeal of fire, the disciple is attacked by crowds of enemies who insult him. Instead of returning insults, the disciple should offer love towards his enemies. This is how he triumphs in this ordeal. When, with serenity, he passes through the fire without being burned. Therefore, the 4 ordeals of earth, fire, water, and air are presented simply for the moral examination of the disciple. All of our defects and moral faults are precisely the negative aspects of the 4 elements of nature, and we have to convert ourselves into kings and queens of it. In the White Lodge, the 4 ordeals are accompanied by a verbal test in order to know what level of purification the disciple has reached. All of these ordeals occur in the astral plane. The prepared disciple, that is to say, the disciple who has spiritual maturity, brings the memory of all this to the physical plane, just as if he would have had a dream. So, when we begin to transmute our sexual energy, we begin to receive these types of ordeals, and we receive them at our level. The beginners receive ordeals for beginners, at their level, so they can see their own ego and be tested. And these ordeals continue throughout the entire path until you're finished. Now, in the beginning, we face 4 symbolic ordeals that represent how each ordeal functions throughout the path. And those 4 symbolic ordeals occur in the astral plane, in relation with the consciousness of the student. Most students, as beginners, don't remember these types of experiences. But every initiate faces these ordeals throughout life, both in the astral plane and the physical plane. And the reason we have to face them physically is because we create the ego physically. We have ego physically here, now. We experience it. We need to deal with it. So we have ordeals. And they get harder the more we fail them. Because the ego needs to be more and more in our face. And it especially happens when we are failing them constantly in the internal worlds, that those experiences will get stronger physically. So if you have a dream related with one of these ordeals and you fail, be prepared. It might come physically too. So ordeals of air are situations given to us by our innermost in relation with our karma. Remember, every ego is a consequence of and a stimulator of karmic consequences, circumstances. When we have attachment to things, when we depend on material things for our security, when we're attached to money or to people or things or environments or places or status, we have egos created in relation with that circumstance. So in order to see that ego, that circumstance has to be shaken by a wind, by the air, so that we will see it in ourselves. So initiates face ordeals related to the loss of what they love. So you might find out that your company is going to be closed, and you're going to lose your job. And if you lose your job, you lose your house, and you lose everything. That would be an ordeal of air. Especially because you heard a rumor, and it's all in your head. Right? It may not even be happening, but because you hear it, and you begin to think about it, and your mind gets upset, the mind races, the mind is very airy, that ordeal becomes quite intense, all in relation with the mind. The reality is that we have a lot of conceptual or intellectual obstacles because what we perceive as our security or what we love is often just intellectual, just concepts in the mind. So in these ordeals, we are being tested for our psychological mobility, our attachments, our capacity for withstanding adversity, and our detachment from material things. Painful. You can see this in dreams. When you have dreams or visions of falling, or you're on the edge of a cliff, or you're in a very high place, and you feel like you might fall, and you become afraid. You don't want to lose where you are or what you have. These types of dreams relate to this type of ordeal. How do you conquer an ordeal of air? With willpower, with remembrance of God, with the fifth element. Ordeals of fire, we will be attacked with fire, persecution, we'll be wronged, criticized, blocked or obstructed, betrayed, in order to arouse our anger, our passion, our emotion, resentment. And this, of course, tests our temperature, our sweetness and serenity. We all have our own flavor of fire in our psyche. Different types of egos that are fiery, and they can come out in different ways. In dreams, we can see big fires, flames, or the threat of being burned in all different forms. Also, criticism can come in the form of arrows and bullets in dreams. So if someone's shooting at you, that's criticism. Also, if someone's stealing your wallet or your ID, they're doing that to steal your image, to gossip about you, to criticize you, to spread negativity about you. And that can also be an ordeal. Ordeals of water is where our circumstances change radically. And this, of course, tests our fluidity and our adaptability. It also tests our altruism and philanthropy. And the reason is because generally we consider our circumstances only in regards to our own well-being. We're very selfish in that way. The inclination of the water element is to give life. So when we have ordeals of water, it's often related to our happiness for others or our generosity, or lack of. And here we can see in dreams drowning, raging waves or seas, floods. We can be trapped out on the ocean or trapped out on a great water. You can also have dreams of rain. Rain, though, specifically symbolizes karma is coming. Something difficult and painful. And it can be related with the water element, but can also be other things. So if you see a big rainstorm and you're getting soaked, you're going to suffer. Some kind of karmic scenario that will be painful. You need an umbrella. And the umbrella is the being. The umbrella is your psychological work. So if you dream that you're having an umbrella and the rain's all around you, but you're not getting wet, that means you have psychological protection. That means that your psychological work is effective. That's a good dream. Ordeals of earth is where we are obstructed, have no way to proceed with our goals, we are restrained or weighed down. So have you ever had a dream where you can't walk, you're trying to run, and you're so slow, you can't get any speed? That's an ordeal of earth. You're too weighed down, often by attachments or by restrictive ways of seeing things. You want things a certain way and they're not that way, and so you're stuck, you can't move. That's earth. This, of course, tests our solidity, perseverance, our ability to deal with inconveniences. Ordeals of earth can also be where we feel like we're being crushed. So if we see in dreams that we're being crushed between giant rocks or stones, or we're being buried alive, or somehow we're doing something in relation with a mountain or a cliff, these can be related to ordeals of earth. Earthquakes. If you have a dream of an earthquake and everything's changing, it's related to all of your circumstances. Everything's going to change. Or it's an ordeal related to change. So you can see that these 4 ordeals are difficult. Not easy. But they also become a little more difficult for us depending on our astrological influences. We all have a personality that was born at a certain time and place. And because of that personality has influences in its formation. Also the body, because they were born at the same time. This is what I was talking about in the last lecture I gave, called The Perception of This Moment. Those astrological influences affect how we see things and affect our natural, or what we feel is our natural inclination, but really it's just personality. There are 12 signs in the zodiac. So there are 4 groups of 3. And those 4 groups each relate to an element. So every astrological sign is related with an element. Related with air, we see Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius. Air signs have a tendency to behave in an airy way. They like it, but it's also their weakness. So an air sign tends to be highly mobile, thrives on change. And so in that sense, they don't have much earth or fire or water. It's hard for them to be fixed and firm, to be solid, to be consistent. And when things are not changing, they get frustrated because they want rapid change. So fire signs are Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. And these have a great range of temperature, tend to be hot and quite dynamic and quick to move from cool to heat. So they can get angry easily, but they can also cool off easily. So they have these tendencies. And then the water signs are Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces. And these are the ones that are very fluid, but they have to do it their way. They respond to change if it's according to their liking and interest. And then finally the earth sign, which is Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn, they don't like change. They like things to be solid, fixed, decided, finished, done, not changing it. It's like this, and that's how I want it, and that's it. No change. And when things change, they really struggle and suffer to adapt. So by understanding your astrological sign, you can start to understand how to deal better with ordeals. Bear in mind that your astrological sign is only corresponding to this lifetime. to this personality, to this body, not the ego. The ego is much older than this body. We've made egos in this life, so those egos were made through the filter of this astrological influence. But the majority of our ego we made in many lives in which we had many different astrological influences. So when you're studying yourself, don't look at everything as though it's astrological. With your sign today, it is not. You have to go deeper. So as I was mentioning, what we need to understand is how these elements function in us psychologically, how they work. And these attributes are most important in our consciousness. Ordeals come to test these qualities in us, to see how they manifest in us. We have a lot of egos related with earth that want things solid and decided. We have a lot of egos related with fluidity, a lot related with temperature, a lot related with mobility. Just because you're a Gemini does not mean all your egos are airy. They are not. We have egos related with all of the elements. The way to conquer the ordeals is to use the other elements. I'm giving you a big clue here. If you're getting an ordeal of fire and your temperature is being tested, what do you think is a good antidote for fire? Anybody have an idea?
Water.
Yeah, water, of course. So if you're getting hot, angry, you need to cool it. And you cool it with being fluid. As a consciousness, being flexible. That's an easy way to counteract those elements, right? To use the other elements against it. But if you really want to fully transform an ordeal completely and never have to repeat it, you need to use the fifth element, the Akash, which is expansiveness, which is self-remembering, self-observation, the presence of God, the remembrance of God, and an attitude in the psyche that does not become identified with any of the other movements of energy or matter. The person who is able to fully be present and cognizant, and they receive criticism and gossip, if they're really cognizant and conscious, the gossip will pass right through them. They won't react with fire, with anger, because they have that expansive quality in their consciousness in the moment. And so that ordeal is seen as what it is, nothing. Just a modification of elements that arose and then passed away. So that person could pass an ordeal easily. The way we fail ordeals is when we become identified, fascinated with the perspective of an ego, and we forget the perspective of the consciousness. So this is really important because this fifth element summarizes everything about the work with consciousness. In the Greek mysteries, this fifth element is symbolized with this curious sign, which looks like the upper part of an S. It's also where we get the number 5. Do you see how that shape looks like a 5? It's the beginning of a number 5. This is a very ancient sign. Now, in the alchemist tradition, the fifth element is called quintessence. And this word comes from the Latin quinta, or quintus, which means fifth. If you look in any Latin language, the word for 5, cinco, quinta, or quinta in Spanish. We see here it's quintas in Latin plus essentia, or essence. So quintessence means the beingness, the essence of a thing, the synthesis of a thing, or its root. And this comes from the Greek ousia, which means being or essence, from ontos, which means to be, from esse, to be. And again, all this you can see in the other Latin languages. To be. So the fifth element is related with consciousness, specifically. Now remember in the beginning I explained that the fifth element is Akash, right? Ether. And it's that first element, or what we call the fifth element, that all the other elements come from. So the Akash, here's what Blavatsky said. Ether in esotericism is the very quintessence of all possible energy, and it is certainly to this universal agent composed of many agents that all the manifestations of energy in the material, psychic, and spiritual worlds are due. This is what Paracelsus was pointing out. That the potential to become a magi, a priest, a magician, in other words, a Buddha, a master, is through the perfection of this quintessence, the fifth element in ourselves. It is the root of everything, and it is the synthesis of everything. Where is it in us? It's in everything in us, because every atom that we have comes from this quintessence. But it's differentiated. It's not perfected. We need to work with it. Where is its root value? Where do we find it? In every atom, of course. But specifically, we find it in the sexual energy. The mantra of the Akash is Ha, that rune Hagal. And here we see an image from Tibetan Buddhism, an image that was hidden in the Lukang, or the ancient secret temple of the Dalai Lamas. The Lukang is a secret temple that was filled with paintings of Tantra. This image shows a yogi performing an exercise that we call pranayama, which means to harness the wind. That wind is not the wind of air. It is the wind of Akash. It is the Ha, the ether. Pranayama is to harness the Akash, the wind. And the mantra for that is Ha. And we see on this graphic that was hidden in Tibet two mantras, one in the sky, which is the Tibetan letter Ah, and one at the mouth of the yogi, which is the Tibetan letter Ha, which is the same mantric value you find in Hinduism and in the Greek mysteries and in all the ancient mysteries around the world. The ether, the Akash, has the value Ha, or the rune Hagal. So here in this exercise, this yogi is transforming all of his forces to raise it in his spinal column. In other words, the Akash, the ether, which is prana, becomes kundalini. It's the same thing. The kundalini is the ultimate synthesis or energy in all things. And when we work to transform sexual energy, we awaken kundalini, the power of the Divine Mother, who is Prakriti. Her name is Prakriti. That power is kundalini, which raises in the spinal column. When we work with that energy successively through our process of spiritual growth, we create what are called solar bodies. Instead of creating physically, outwardly, we begin to create inwardly through Tantra, through a specific science, where those energies are raised in us physically, vitally, emotionally, intellectually, and in our body of will. And we create solar bodies, not lunar bodies, solar. These are bodies created by the Akash in the fifth and sixth dimensions. In other words, the Kundalini begins to manifest those three forces in us through these bodies. And we see here how those Hebrew letters are related to these bodies and the solar forces. That's a long work. But what that represents is the power of the magician. This triangle, Netzach, Hod, and Yasod, is the triangle of magic. The magician is the one who has created those bodies, thereby creating perfect vessels for the expression of the Akash. And the Akash works through those four forces, the four elements, through these bodies. The Akash itself, through Tiferet, the causal body, or the Bodhisattva, who commands the powers of the air in the mental body, the powers of the fire in the astral body, the powers of the water and the vital body, and in the physical body. All of that is Kundalini, raised and awakened and empowered. It is the power of Akash. To acquire that, you have to first conquer the elements in your own psyche. And that is not easy. Do you have any questions? Did I drop a bomb on you? Please.
You mentioned these bodies will create solid bodies, not lunar bodies.
Mm-hmm.
What will be a lunar body?
Good
What
question.
will be its function?
What we have now are what we call lunar bodies, because they are bodies created under the influence of the moon, physically and spiritually. The moon is, of course, the Divine Mother, Luna, or Selene. So our physical body was created under the influence of the forces of the moon, and so was the bodies of our mind and heart. Our psyche, in other words, is a child of the moon. And those bodies will be returned back to nature. They belong to nature. We didn't create them. In order to become immortal, you need immortal bodies. Those bodies are created by the Son, by Christ. And that's what Jesus was saying in the Bible, you must be born again. That spiritual birth is the creation of the chariot of Ezekiel, or the Merkabah of the Kabbalists. And that's this. It's the golden body of the solar man. It's hidden in the Greek and Egyptian mysteries. It's the creation of what in Hinduism or Buddhism is called the subtle body, or illusionary body. And that's a different type of body that exists in the internal worlds, and which is immortal. It's the body of an angel. It's created through the highest and most perfect atoms that we have access to. The creation's not physical, it's internal. So it's a long process. Someone who has that, who has just created it, has developed a vehicle to be conscious in the internal world and to use that to further redeem themselves from their mistakes. So it's something that's not vague, but very real, and something that you would experience if you had that. More questions? Sure. Please.
In the Tarot and Kabbalah, it's mentioned about the two pillars, Jachin and Boaz,
Mm-hmm.
four levels of sin.
Mm-hmm.
Is that related to, is there a direct connection of those four levels of sin with this?
Yeah. The four bodies of sin are the lunar bodies. It's the same thing. Those four bodies are these four lower Sephiroth. But the lunar mental body, lunar astral, lunar vital, lunar physical. Those are the four bodies of sin. We call them that because they are the bodies through which we have committed what's called in Hebrew rashang, or ra, impurity, sin. The word in Hebrew for sin is ra. So the tree of life, or the tree of knowledge of good and evil, doesn't say good and evil there. It says purity and impurity, and that impurity is ra. So the four bodies of impurity are these four lunar vessels that we've infected with our ego. They weren't that way when they were first made. We infected them, made them sick. So we made them into bodies of impurity through our mistakes.
Well, they are the same vessels.
Mm-hmm. We've had lunar bodies since we entered into manifestation. The ones that change are the vital and physical bodies, because we take new ones with each incarnation. But the mind-heart, or astral mental, is the same one that you had when you were a plant or an animal or a mineral. It's a lunar vessel, given to us by the moon and taken away by the moon. So at some point we need to redeem ourselves from that lunar aspect. Difficult work. Any questions in the back? Okay.
In the Taoism or Chinese alchemy, there is first the Wu Qi and Prakriti, and then there are 5 elements: fire, metal, wood, earth, water. So those Wu Qi make the 6th element, and are wood and metal different elements?
So the question is about how Chinese alchemy or Taoism breaks down the manifestation and expression of these images. In Taoist alchemy, if you study how it's laid out, it's exactly the same as Kabbalah. It's only slightly different. And it's mostly a psychological point of view, but it's expressed in essentially the same way. The way we decided to explain it today is slightly simplified because it's already a lot. It's complicated. We're trying to present it in a way that we can utilize practically in our moment-to-moment work. The reality is that the expression of the absolute into manifestation is far more complicated, and there are many more levels. So Chinese alchemy or Taoism conceptualizes those complexities. But again, it's a little out of context for today's lecture to go into all the details. In the back.
You mentioned Michael Mayer. In his Atalanta Fusion, there's one of the plates shows they've got these screens, and they're collecting the rose, and there are two alchemists that are bringing out
Right.
one of these into, and you can see the dew coming down into this vessel, and my understanding is that's the sexual alchemy.
Mm-hmm.
But one of those sheets is in the form of a lozenge, which is the quintessence.
Mm-hmm.
As I've read through alchemy, whenever you see water in these images, I've always understood it to be that you're working in the astral. But from what you're saying here, you're saying that the water is very different. It's a very different element to that. So am I just misinterpreting this?
Well, I've seen the images that you're referring to, the other images from Atalanta Fusions. And that same image is also in the Mudas Liber, where you see the couple gathering the dew and purifying the dew. That meaning, of course, is symbolic, and it is related with sexual energy. It's also related with emotional energy. As I explained, all of these elements are in all the levels. Even in Keter, you find these in their level. So in every level of manifestation, you find these elements, right? Specifically, in relation with water or mem, we see that its primary mode of expression is in the vital body. It's the sexual water. But at the same time, mem, water, is emotional. How do you have sex without emotion? Sex is an emotional process. That's what empowers it. So mem is also emotional. So when I mentioned that in dreams, if you see a raging ocean, that can represent the churning of sexual waters in you. But it can also represent the churning of your emotions. And it could be both. So you have to look into your own circumstances to see how the dream should be interpreted. So in that sense, we can see that mem is here in the Yasod related with the forces of the vital body, sexual forces. But that mem is in the physical body too. Everything we are is water. The body is mostly water. And that water is stimulated through all these forces. Likewise, in the astral body, as the emotional body, it's very influenced by the tattva of apas, that watery element. So it's both. This is partly what the intellect struggles to grasp, is that symbols are multidimensional and multifaceted. And this is the beauty of Kabbalah, is it helps you to start to understand that you can't put a single definition to everything, because everything is interconnected and interpenetrating. So in order to understand your dreams and to understand alchemy and to understand Kabbalah and understand all these symbols, you need the consciousness that has these qualities I was explaining. We tend to be, especially intellectually, we want everything to be a very fixed and solid, because here in our physical bodies, in our earth, we want that. The mind that we have here in this earth wants things this way. It sees black or white. It can't stand to have things undefined. And that's why today we love a politician, and then when they make a mistake, we hate them. we don't understand that that's just a human being, and he's not perfect. We can't stand that in-between place, and we're that way with everything. When we see a symbol, we want it to be one thing and won't want to grasp that it's more. So this is why these other elements can be important in our interpretations of things. Samael Aun Weor said a very useful thing about interpreting dreams. He said dreams should be analyzed without subjectivity, without desire, without wanting a particular result. And what he was saying is that we need to analyze dreams from the point of view of Akash, with a totally open mind, without a preconception, but to see it for what it is and to listen to intuition. So the same is like when we study alchemy, we study those old paintings. There are levels and levels of meaning, especially in the genuine alchemical writings and images. Levels and levels and levels. So we have to have that sort of flexible approach in our interpretations.
How should we and guide the breath towards the spinal column?
How should we breathe and guide the breath towards the spinal column? Well, there are specific techniques of breathing that we teach in this tradition. Specifically, in regard to harnessing sexual energy, we teach techniques called pranayama. Also, runes, mantras, and other types of exercises that harness those energies. And they depend on the quality of breath that we have. We need a type of breathing that's very relaxed and is very cognizant or conscious. But most importantly, in order to harness that energy and direct it, we need to be working on our psyche. We need to be working on being here and now and stopping harmful thoughts, feelings, and actions. This is the most important way to redirect energy. The truth is that we're so asleep and such beginners that we really can't be trusted with the powers that are in the Akash. If you look at what we've already done with our energy, we've committed a lot of really harmful actions against ourselves and others. So for that reason, depending on your own karma and the nature of your own situation, it is most likely that your innermost, through the auspices of your Divine Mother, will snatch every atom that you manage to release or purify. So if you manage to overcome an ordeal and transform an experience and free consciousness from an ego, your Divine Mother will immediately take all that energy so you can't abuse it. Because she knows we're like little children in a kitchen full of sharp knives. So she's got her eye on us. And she doesn't want us to get hurt or hurt someone else. So my advice to students is, in the beginning, learn the exercises, but keep your focus squarely on working on changing your behaviors, physically and psychologically. Let your Divine Mother manage your energy, your spiritual energies. Let her take those forces and use them for your benefit, and pray to her in that regard. Constantly. Always pray to your Divine Mother. She's the one who guides us along the path and leads us back to where we should be, and then beyond that. So in the meantime, learn the practices, learn the visualizations, learn the mantras and techniques so you understand how they work, but keep your attention on working on your psychological defects.
How does matter, energy, and consciousness relate to affirming the nine conciliating, or creator, preserver, destroyer?
The interrelationship of the Trinity and all its levels is expressed in the Tree of Life itself. So to understand how the upper Trinity, or creator, destroyer, and sustainer, manifesting creation, we see that expressed in the Tree of Life. The Trinity is simply an expression of how the one law creates. So if we look at the shape of a triangle, we see 3 points. We also see 3 faces. But what is the most important part of that triangle? Anybody see it? It's the space inside of it. It's the space outside of it. Those 3 create definition. They establish a firmament, as was explained in the recent lecture. The way those three express and work changes through all the levels of manifestation. It's always different. We have three brains. We have three nervous systems. They relate to each other. To create sexually, we need the power of three: man, woman, and sex. To have electricity, we have three aspects of that energy: positive, negative, and grounding or neutral. So in every case, we see the forces of three, but we wouldn't be able to sit down and make a chart that connects force number one with force number one with force number one. Because in all those cases, what's making that power possible is that empty space in the middle. It's the ether, the akash, the prakriti. In other words, instead of trying to connect the corners of each triangle to all the other corners of all the other triangles, look at what connects them all together, which is that space in the middle. It's the power of akash. The intellectual connections between those corners often is not possible. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And ultimately, it's more or less irrelevant. Yes?
Is it possible to have built the solar bodies and to still be asleep and not know that we have did this work in the past? Or will we know that we have these bodies by our dream?
So the question is, how will we know if we have solar bodies? Maybe we created them before. Will we see some sign? Well, my question to you would be, if you woke up in a hospital bed, having been in a coma, how would you know what you did before? Who you were, where you were, what kind of life you had, who your family was? The answer's the same. You have to awaken. You have to wake up and recapitulate your memory, recover your memory, in order to know if you created physical bodies or solar bodies before, or if you reach some level of development in a previous existence. You have to awaken. It's the only way to find out. If someone comes in the room and says, "You are really bad," or "You were a king, you were a pharaoh," naturally your pride will go, "I knew it. I suspected as much." But you won't know. Or if you're lying there in your hospital bed and you have a dream that you were Tutankhamun and all your slaves were feeding you grapes and honey and wine, and you wake up in your hospital bed and you say, "Yeah, I was Tutankhamun." But you have no idea because you're in a hospital bed. That's our state, spiritually. We are in a spiritual hospital. It's called gnosis. We are all sick spiritually, near death spiritually. And there are doctors trying to help us. I'm not a doctor, I'm just a nurse. A male nurse, even worse. So the doctors are the masters of the White Lodge. They are your own being, who is the doctor who can give you the medicine you need. Your memory will be recovered as you work on yourself. As you're lying in that hospital bed and you're observing your psychological qualities, you are seeing what you were in the past, because what you were in the past created what you are now. Everything is cause and effect. If you're lying there asleep with no intuition about anything, with no knowledge of anything, chances are you never did anything. Chances are you're no one, like the rest of us. Generally, that question comes up, did we create the solar bodies in the past? Because the ego is saying, maybe I'm better than everybody else. Maybe I did it before. That's pride. That's where you should work. Maybe you did. But let me tell you something. If you did create the bodies in the past, and now you're asleep, you're actually worse than everyone else. Because you had that, and you threw it away. So that pride that's looking to be better, you need to see that, and see that actually you're worse. So be careful what you ask for. Because you might find out that you're actually worse than others, not better. More questions?
How can we overcome lethargy and inertia spiritual progress saps energy from life related to the elements?
How do we overcome spiritual lethargy or laziness that prevents us from working? The best antidote for spiritual or conscious lethargy is to try to comprehend the teachings in your own experience. To really look in your day-to-day experience at your suffering and the suffering of others, and look to see what causes it. You have to become convinced about karma. You also have to become convinced about the inevitability of death. In other words, you need to start from the beginning. I've explained in many lectures now about the 3 levels of instruction that are given traditionally in Asian traditions, but that are also visible in the Western. And the first level of instruction in classic Buddhism is in the Sutrayana level, and those are the 2 focuses that all students undergo, even for lifetimes. Comprehending karma and comprehending the impermanence of the physical body, the inevitability of death. If you have a strong spiritual laziness, it's because you have not fully understood that you are going to die. And you don't know when, and you don't know how, and you have no control over it. If you really, really, really focus on that from moment to moment, the impermanence of the body and its weakness, and you combine that with analyzing how your behaviors and the behaviors of others produce suffering, you will develop spiritual motivation. The recognition that you must change, and that change has to come from psychological changes in order to change the trajectory of your life. That is the antidote. And the way you empower that is by where you can and how you can applying the techniques. Generally speaking, people have spiritual laziness because they've not learned how to use the techniques effectively, so they haven't gotten any fruit from them. People who don't meditate generally don't meditate because they never got anything out of it, or they didn't learn how to get anything out of it. If you learn how to meditate properly, you will want to meditate because you will get fruit. You will get nourishment from that practice. It will help you. You will want it. The same way now that you want to eat a meal because you're hungry, you will have spiritual hunger that can only be satisfied by meditating. But until someone gives you that first bite of food and shows you how to eat it, you will never know. So you have to learn how to practice. Meditation, mantras, vowels, runes, and the other types of exercises all provide nourishment that strengthen our spiritual motivation. So you need all that. If you don't have it, find a way to learn. We have many books, we have many lectures, many courses, there are retreats, there are schools, there are many ways that you can acquire that type of training. And you need that. If you feel that you need more spiritual motivation, that is motivation in itself. If you feel that you are spiritually lazy, you are recognizing what you need, which is nourishment. Any other questions? In the back?
Does the innermost suffer in hell, or is just purely ego?
Does the innermost suffer in hell, or is it just the ego? In hell, we only find those atoms of our consciousness that have been trapped through our mistaken behaviors, physically and psychologically. But all of those atoms of our consciousness belong to our innermost. So by extension, our innermost suffers because we are in hell. Anyone who's been a parent and loves their child would suffer if that child were imprisoned or sick with a fatal illness. We would suffer. Our Divine Mother and our Divine Innermost suffer in the same way, but far more profoundly for us, because we are their child. And we are suffering in the consequences of our mistaken behaviors, trapped in our pride and anger and lust, and suffering the consequences of those actions. So our innermost suffers in that way. Not in hell, but suffering because we suffer. Question?
How is the attention related to time?
How is the Akash related to time? There is no relationship between Akash and time. Akash emerges out of the Ein Sof, which is timeless. There is a progression of change because things move and change. So from our point of view, we could call that time, but in that place, it is a timelessness. What we experience as time is strictly related to the third dimension, to physical matter. When you move out of that dimension and you have your consciousness awake in the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, and then the zero dimension, you find that there is no time there. It's an eternal moment, an eternal now, even though there is change. So it sounds conceptual what I'm explaining, but it's something that you can experience. As a simple example that illustrates that reality, have you ever took a nap for 10 minutes and woke up and felt like you were out for hours? Like you lie down and you sleep and you have dreams and dreams and dreams and dreams and dreams and dreams, and then you wake up thinking, I'm late for work or I'm late for this and that, but you look at your watch, it's only been 10 or 15 minutes. That's an illustration of that. There is no time there. We can experience change and things happen, but it's not with that impression that we have of time. And that impression of time is produced by the physical brain in relation with the senses in the body. Was there another question? In the back. Yeah, the symbol for that quintessence is a serpent. That symbol is where we get the letter S and the number 5. So, and it is a serpent. It is the Nahash.
The presentation of this lecture was made possible by donations from listeners like you. Will you help others to benefit from this knowledge? Most Gnostic schools recommend a donation of $10 to $20 per lecture. Every single donation helps. Make a donation now at gnosticradio.org. For questions and deeper understanding of this lecture, we invite you to explore the books published by Glorian Publishing and available from booksellers worldwide. Visit gnosticbooks.org to learn more. Thank you. May all beings be happy.